morning, fellas.
Good morning. Good morning.
Yeah, here we are. Okay, we're in week 6 of our introduction to the Gospel of John, and I'm tying the word introduction into the first 18 verses, which is called the prologue of John's Gospel. We've been analyzing it in pretty good depth this morning. We've reached a key, really a key hinge in this prologue, verse 14. And so, by way of review, what we've looked at is we're looking at, we're approaching this as John is using and employing a method of interpretation that was quite well known at the time. And the term that came to be known as is midrashic interpretation, where John is actually starting out, and in my language, he's reinterpreting Genesis chapter 1. The correlation between the opening text of John 1 and Genesis 1 is just profound. In the beginning God created, and in John, in the beginning was the Word. So I'm looking at this as he's building his prologue, and this prologue, this story, is going to be the introduction to the gospel, and to the degree that we can build a framework for understanding, it's going to help us then look at how he profiles Jesus Christ in his interaction in his ministry for the remainder of the book. So that's what we're looking at. I've put it into movements of his thought as he tells this story, retells this story. John 1 and 2 is the Word's relationship with the Godhead. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then he moves on, and he says in movement 2, the Word's relationship to all that exists. And he says, all things were created by him, and nothing that has been created, or I forget how it's King Jamish, and so I kind of lose it. But basically, he's saying very loosely, is in 3 and 4, is that everything was created and is stained through the Word. The Word is the central idea of the opening verses of John, and then he introduces what I call the problem statement of the story. Yeah, everything's looking good. In the beginning was this Word, and this Word created all things and sustains all things. But there's a problem, and it's the darkness. The light penetrates the darkness, but the darkness can't overcome it. And we've interpreted that as can't understand it. So there's this light that permeates, that's coming from the Word, but the darkness can't receive it. And so there is this problem statement in verse 5. But then he goes on in verses 6 through 13, and he says, but the Word continues to speak. And that's what we've been looking at. Remember, I spent a couple weeks there and looked at the entire Old Testament history in this light, that the Word has always been present. The Word has continued to seek relationship with all of mankind. But then the darkness of mankind, because of this problem that occurred in Genesis 3, is that it keeps running up against. The darkness cannot receive it, but the Word continues to speak. So that's where we looked at. That's where we've been. But then we moved to movement 5, and that's where we are now at this hinge, is that the Word now becomes flesh and dwells among us. And this is where we left off last week. A couple things here. What I want you to see is, note that in the beginning, verse 1, I want you to see the correlation between verse 1 and verse 14. The Word was God, a declarative statement. Notice right here it says, the story begins with a declaration. The Word was God. And then he moves from there into more observation and development of the story. But then in verse 14, there's a parallel verse. Now, the Word became flesh. It's declarative. Declaration, observation, and then declaration. These are two major events or points in the story, in the retelling of the story. The Word was God, and the Word became flesh. Now note, in the secondary clause in verse 14, and dwelt among us. What does that ring a bell? I mean, what bell rings in your head? Of course, I've given you a hint. The Word, in some of our texts, it reads, and the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. Remember? Okay, it's a reference to Exodus. Now, there's a shift. Or not a shift in explanation, but a development of the story. In John's audience, guys, John's audience, they believed, they saw all of life primarily from a historically Jewish perspective. These people, this audience, were people who had listened to the Old Testament scriptures week after week as they gathered in, of course, in the earlier days in this temple, but now in synagogue. They would hear the text and the story being the one story. And that story has two parts. The story has the story of creation and then the story of redemption. The story of creation is the story that John referenced in Genesis chapter 1, and now he's moving to the rest of the story, which is the story of redemption inaugurated through Moses, and it's the whole history of Israel. There's a releasing out of slavery and a development of the nation and an occupation of the land and a development of the king, the Lord's anointed. And that story has dramatically come to an abrupt halt in the 6th century, 586. That Lord's anointed. You know, the pinnacle time under David and Solomon came to an abrupt halt under the destruction through Babylon in 586, where the last Lord's anointed, the last king of Israel, he was taken out, and his sons were killed, and his eyes were put out, Zedekiah, in 2 Kings chapter 25. So these people are living in this state where they have believed this story, the story of creation and the story of how God has redeemed all things, but it has become an abrupt halt, and it's created this jungle of belief, an awaiting of, will God act once again? You know, what will this one who's to come, what will he look like? Well, this all ties in because I think this is the background of what we're reading here. John, and we'll look at this if you take the rest of the text that we'll be looking at here in through verse 18, his reference to Moses. He's bringing Moses into the story and the story of redemption. So, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And just as a reference at this point, I'm thinking he's moving his thought now to the redemptive story of the greater story. So, why? Well, I've already given some explanation, but let's look at it. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And so we've got these two parallel major points in the prologue. The Word was God, and then the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. You know, what is the idea? And that's what I've been pondering. I've come up with 3 ideas. Number one, it's one idea with 3 subparts. In John's, as he tells the story, the Word has always been. The Word has always been. And the Word is the creator and the sustainer of all mankind. The Word has always sought relationship, and this is from my perspective, that the major idea of Scripture and all of the greater story is the story of bringing it all back together again, where God and His creation are all one. And we're going to see this as we read the gospel. The Word has always sought to to restore that which has been lost. And then finally, the Word now becomes flesh. The Word, this is in a sense, this is culminative. This is big. And so we have to ask why. Why would God choose to become flesh? Why would the Word choose to become flesh? And that's what, actually, this is where we left off last week. At our table time, I asked you guys to explore this question. Why? Well, I've given this some thought, and I'm going to throw my hat into the ring. And this is how I interpret the ministry, the incarnation, and the whole ministry of Jesus. And I use this term, maximum identification. This, in my opinion, is why the incarnation, where God became flesh and to dwell among us, to tabernacle, to make his residence among us, to live and to breathe, to eat and to sleep and to be and to interact within the jungle that is the context of which he's entering. And I'll leave it at that, because what I want us to do is to discuss this. You know, we all have our idea of why the incarnation. You know, some of us view it as, well, Jesus is on a mission. I can't argue that. Yes, he's on a mission. But I'd like for us to pause this morning with maybe as we interact around the table, to talk about this. What, as we look at maximum identification with mankind and all of creation, as you think about this term, what are some possibilities? And then secondly, how might this framework, by looking at Jesus through the lens of maximum identification, how might that framework create understanding as we move from this hinge, this doorway, actually, into the gospel itself? So let's. I'm going to leave this slide up here. We've got 10 minutes, and then I'll probably wrap us back up here for a few minutes, because I'd really like to hear what you have to say. So I'll join the group.
Sounds like you thought about this one.
And you're not talking about
It's over here and this, I got this, and I'll see this.
I know this is. All the time. There's a few that we need to do something more dramatic here. Years ago, I thought that's kind of the best way that I could communicate would be to become
Bring this.
really not getting past the tweet tires. So this thing I should become like one of them. So I can
Open access.
Why?
Just how.
I mean, that's all. Which will prove out later on. I'll see if this works. We can choose Hebrews. I think John is introducing there was the first creation. Gives light into the first creation.
God revealing himself, God identifying.
the thing is, it's not done.
It's the church. Yes, that's right. And
Everybody gets saved. It's not it's, I really, that's and the biggest
requirement for high.
Yeah, and when we walk with God, Moses, you go talk to God. Well, no, I don't want to talk. That's why he said, what he said, right? This idea of this guy was significant. So awesome, cheerful. So all of a sudden, this idea of relationship with God is love, the maximum love sex started. Now I can see and hear and he says to me, that the action of see God himself. What I thought of whenever this all started,
Creation was intended as
People were the point, people were the point of creation.
but he always identifies maximum.
Creation of consciousness, very similar, he said, to stage, that was that was and then, it's like building a temple, it's just to build. That's the sort of thing that is the image of God in the temple. And the team was the image. Football field, and the temple was just creation. Take that as image in it. Image that was
part of the filling.
restoring the image.
This is his prescription. It's a really a
Believers over age is beginning. Activating the darkness.
Yeah, that would be first. Is that it? Well, guys, boy, there's a lot of interaction around the table. What I gotta believe is that we're kind of into this. We're willing to look at this with new eyes and different getting interaction from each other. I'd like to hear. We got a few minutes here. What are your thoughts? In relation to this maximum identification of Jesus and profiling him in that regard. What are some of the things you guys talked about?
Well, I guess we kind of came around not only maximum exposure, or maximum exposure. He exposed himself to all people, from the blind to the lepers, all the way up the line to the Sadducees and the Pharisees. We didn't touch on that, but the whole range of people that he exposed himself to. He came out of the woodwork, and he was there at all levels. He was there for everybody.
That's
I think
good.
one of the guys
Very good thought.
here in the group, and he was there for everybody. It was just wow.
He didn't
Not
drive
just
around in a
few.
limo,
Yeah.
air-conditioned limo. He rubbed shoulders with people.
Unlike the Sadducees and Pharisees who were just in their own little clique and their own little group.
Good. Great. What do you think from that table? There was a real glow at that table.
When you point, all those other ones are pointing back at you, right?
Well, in essence, I think the fulcrum of what we discussed was the why was he came to reestablish and complete the intimate relationship that the Godhead had with his creation originally. And the only way to do that, as is said here, is to cover the waterfront and be with everyone. There's no hierarchy to go through, there's none of that. You can personally experienced this, and then we didn't even get to the point of touching of the promise that he left through the Holy Spirit after he left physically.
Right, yeah.
Which is the key to our walking in the kingdom now.
Right. That's
Not
yet to
not
come.
waiting until he comes again, but we can walk in that now.
Right, yeah. And so in that light of these two tables, it's really interesting. If God of all creation could choose how to rub shoulders and walk and what was the term you used to expose, what do you do? And we see that in Jesus Christ. We see what that is in Jesus Christ. It kind of tells a huge story.
Yeah.
So how about over here, you guys, on this side of the room? Dick, yeah.
I just thought it was, I couldn't even pronounce those words that you put on the screen there. National identification, I couldn't say those words. It just came down to me, it was a manifestation of God's love. That no one, at least my understanding, no one's ever seen God.
Yeah.
Okay. Jesus says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. So he sent Jesus to, and actually underlying the idea that he wanted to be in relationship with us. So that was kind of what I just thought was just a manifestation of God's love, sending Jesus.
It sure is.
And Everett, you said what? John 3:16.
Well, I was thought of that, but I also came to me that it said that he was tempted in every way as we are yet without sin. So as he exposed himself, as Carl said, we were aware that we had to seek God this way. That he could be tempted in everything. Identified with that. And yet without sin.
Yeah, that part of that idea that it came, maximum identification includes that.
And that also that God said, this is yes, I'm gonna get rid of it all. But then one man, Noah, 8 people, but they still had original sin. That was not the answer. He had to finally,
Yeah.
and God identified with all that and decided he had to send Jesus for that.
You know, the tension in this whole thing, and it'll probably remain a tension, is some of us get the idea that one is that the God of the Old Testament is a different God than the God of the New Testament. I don't buy that myself. I think the word has always been there active. The problem is on our end receiving it. But then on the other hand, you think, is God white knuckling it? And find, maybe this will work. I don't buy that. God is God. It's got to be part, in my mind, part of a master plan of things.
From
The
beginning.
story, the ultimate story, and within that story, there's a creation, there's a loss, and there's a reconciliation. That is the story. Yeah.
And Paul said before the foundation
Yeah.
of the earth, this
Yeah.
was all.
And you mentioned Paul. I think this framework for understanding was part of the New Testament psyche. Paul writes in Colossians, I was going to read it, where he opens up the book of Colossians and he points to Jesus Christ as being the firstborn of creation. And then he goes on and says, and he's the firstborn among the dead. Firstborn. There is the creative order that all things were created and sustained through him, but yet he was the firstborn of the redemption, of the reconciliation. And so there's this creation and reconciliation. Yes.
Well, I think what Ray said, the creation account also describes it. If you read it, like you read it in Babylon, it describes the building of a temple. He sets a whole stage. All temples had this construction process. They built the temple to their gods, whoever they were. And the last thing they did when the temple's completed is they put the image of their god in the temple. So now the image of their god had a place to live. Well, the creation of God creates a temple, and we were supposed to be the image of God. It says so. And so when he made his flesh, it's why did he make flesh? We're the point of it all. We're the point of everything. We're the point of creation. The creation exists because God wanted a place for us to be. So we're the whole. He kind of had to become
The dwelling place.
We're the point of everything. And that's pretty.
That's pretty profound. Yeah.
We're the purpose.
Yeah. So these thoughts, you know, we're pausing. We're in slow-mo right now. We're in slow-mo because John 1:14 and the rest of this prologue, verses 14 through 18. This is critical. This is important for us to understand as we move into the text and we watch the rest of the story take place. So,
You know, Mike, regarding the rest of the story, Paul Harvey.
Date yourself.
In the example of the bird in the barn,
Yeah.
you know.
The what?
In the story of the bird in the barn, in
Oh.
other words, God was trying to get the birds out of the cold and into the warmth of the barn. The only way you could do that was to create a bird that would draw that bird, the other birds into the barn. So your white knuckling is not too far off, I think, from that thought, because it involves a broken relationship and a restoration of that relationship, and Christ was that vehicle that he used to restore mankind to that relationship.
yeah, there's no doubt. Yeah. But Iman. Okay, well, we are over 5 minutes. Apologize today, but God, this is really, this is really fun stuff. This is core. So anyway, we'll meet here. We'll be here again next week, and we got a week or two left in in this verse. We're gonna look at John 1:14 and the rest of that text there, 18, in light of. I'm going to propose it as John is now not retelling Exodus, but he's referring to the second Exodus through Jesus Christ. And that's how we'll be looking at it. So, the second and the last Exodus. All right. Well, see you guys.
So, it's too short to do it on Friday. The joy is coming out.
Did you go online?
No, but it's only that
You've been over there again, Marshall?
because they unrolled
Any Bibles?
and then they sang the
Enjoying
praise.
something and learning something.
Yeah.
Learning something.